August 7th, 1944. Just before midnight. A stony ridge east of the Norman village of Mortain, 314 meters above sea level, roughly 1,030 feet, rising some 600 feet above the valley floor below. Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss is 21 years old. He is lying flat on a slab of limestone near the summit of a hill the Americans call Hill 314, with a pair of field glasses pressed to his face and a signal corps radio at his side. From here, the land drops away sharply to the west, and down in the valley he can see the road. He can see the German column on the road. Panzer IVs and Panthers and half-tracks and infantry in field grey, moving toward the town of Saint-Hilaire-du-Harcouët and the road that leads on to Avranches. He counts 15 vehicles, then 20. He stops counting. He picks up the handset. He gives a target location. 5 miles behind him, in a camouflaged gun position he cannot see, a captain leans over a firing chart. A staff sergeant reads coordinates back over a wire. 12 105mm howitzers of a battery belonging to the 230th Field Artillery Battalion swing their muzzles right. The fire direction officer picks up his phone. He says 3 words back. On the way. Seconds later, the column below is burning. Over the next 6 days, Weiss will call 193 fire missions from that hill. And on one of those days, when soldiers of the 2nd SS Panzer Division crawl close enough to his perimeter that his own outposts pull back, he will give the Fire Direction Center his own coordinates. He will bring the guns down on himself. The Germans surrounding that hill have no framework for what is happening to them. They have better guns. They have more experienced crews. They have an artillery tradition that stretches back to the Kaisers. And they are being dismantled, battery by battery and company by company, by a 21-year-old lieutenant with a backpack radio calling fire missions that their own doctrine says cannot be done. Here is the thing the Wehrmacht never understood. Calling artillery onto your own position is not a desperate act. It is not a last resort. It is a procedure. It is something the Americans trained for. It is something a 19-year-old sergeant from East Texas could do from memory. And the reason the Germans could not do it, the reason it was outside their doctrine, their culture, and their entire professional imagination, reveals something about why the most professional army of the 20th century lost the war to a nation of draftees who had been civilians 18 months earlier. This is not a story about courage, though there is plenty of that in it. It is a story about trust, and if you want to understand how trust becomes a weapon, stay with me. Before we get there, do something for these men. If this kind of history matters to you, the kind where the real reason things happened is stranger and more human than anything in a textbook, take 2 seconds and hit the subscribe button. These stories survive because people like you make them findable. Subscribe and then come back, because what follows will change the way you think about who actually decides a battle. To understand what Robert Weiss was doing on that hill, you need to understand the machine behind him. You need to understand how the United States Army had built, quietly, in the budget-starved years between the wars, the most responsive artillery fire support system any army had ever fielded. And to understand that, you need to go back to a patch of flat, dusty ground in southwest Oklahoma and a major whose name almost nobody knows today. It starts at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In 1911, the Army established its Field Artillery School there, in country that suited the long distances of artillery practice. Through the 1920s, the school was underfunded and largely overlooked. Congress was not interested in artillery. The Army was not particularly interested in Oklahoma. The school ground along, teaching the same doctrines inherited from the First World War, procedures that were slow, complex, and tied to the geometry of fixed gun positions. Inside the gunnery department, one man saw the problem clearly. His name was Carlos Brewer. He was a West Point graduate of the class of 1913, a Kentuckian who had spent his career in field artillery and who understood, better than most of his contemporaries, that the way the Army computed and directed fire was the fundamental bottleneck in the entire system. When Brewer became director of the gunnery department in the late 1920s, he began taking the procedure apart and rebuilding it from the ground up. The old method required the artillery battery to be the center of the mathematical universe. The observer in the field had to know exactly where the battery was, exactly where the target was, and give the battery all the data it needed to compute its own firing solution. This meant the observer carried an enormous cognitive and procedural burden. It meant the computation took time. It meant that in a fluid battle, where the observer was moving and the battery might have displaced, the system could break down completely. What Brewer introduced was a fundamental reversal of that logic. Instead of computing fires from the battery's perspective, he pushed toward a system where any observer, anywhere, could give a map location and have the fire computed for him by specialists at a centralized position well behind the guns. The observer did not need to know where the battery was. He did not need to do trigonometry under fire. He needed a map, a radio, and a call format that any trained soldier could recite from memory. He sent the location of the target. The specialists behind the guns solved the rest. Brewer's successor as director of the gunnery department was Major Orlando Ward. Ward took Brewer's concepts and built the formal architecture around them. He called it the Fire Direction Center. One tent or dugout per artillery battalion, staffed by officers and sergeants with plotting charts and firing tables, connected to every gun in the battalion by wire, and connected to the observer in the field by radio. The observer called the target. The Fire Direction Center did all the mathematics. The guns fired. Ward demonstrated this on the Fort Sill ranges in the early 1930s, and what he showed was something that no other army in the world had yet built. A single battalion of 12 howitzers could mass all its fires on a single target called by a single observer, with the complete firing solution computed and transmitted in under 3 minutes. Not 10 minutes, not 15, 3. The significance of that demonstration is difficult to overstate. Every artillery system in the world at that moment computed fires from the battery's position outward. Ward had reversed the entire geometry. He had made the observer the center of the system, not the guns. The guns existed to serve the observer. The observer could be anyone with a map and a radio. He did not have to be an artilleryman. He did not have to know anything about ballistics or powder charges or wind correction. He had to know where he was, where the target was, and how to make the call. Everything else was someone else's problem. That reorientation of the entire artillery system around the observer at the front was the most consequential doctrinal decision the United States Army made between the two world wars. Almost no one noticed it at the time. The Army was small, underfunded, and largely invisible to the American public in 1931. But the system Brewer and Ward built on those flat Oklahoma ranges would eventually direct more fire, more accurately, more quickly, than any artillery system in history. The radio that carried the observer's voice to the Fire Direction Center was the Signal Corps Radio 300, designed and built by Motorola, the first true backpack walkie-talkie. It weighed approximately 38 pounds with its battery. It transmitted on frequency modulation in the very high-frequency band, with a reliable range of approximately 3 miles under field conditions. Motorola produced nearly 50,000 of them during the war. By the time the Americans landed in Normandy in June 1944, the SCR-300 was as standard a piece of infantry equipment as a rifle. The call for fire procedure had been standardized into 6 elements: observer identification, telling the Fire Direction Center who was calling and where, a warning order naming the type of fire requested, the target location in map grid coordinates, a description of the target, the method of engagement, meaning how the observer wanted the fire delivered, and finally the method of fire and control, meaning when to shoot, and whether the observer wanted to adjust or fire for effect immediately. 6 pieces of information. Any trained soldier could transmit them in under 30 seconds. Every officer below major in a field artillery unit knew them cold. So did most of the senior enlisted men. And by the campaigns of 1944, so did a substantial number of infantry officers who had been cross-trained on the procedure. There was a principle embedded in how the system was trained, never explicitly written into a field manual but fundamental to how the doctrine worked. If the observer gave a location and called a target, the Fire Direction Center fired. It did not ask for confirmation from battalion. It did not pass the request up to regiment. It fired. The observer could see the target. The men in the Fire Direction Center could not. The doctrine trusted the man who could see. That was the theory. The theory met reality in Tunisia in February 1943, and reality was not kind. American maps were bad. Radios broke. Forward observers who had trained on flat Oklahoma ranges were getting killed in the mountains of North Africa because they were exposing themselves too long to confirm firing corrections. At Kasserine Pass, when German armor hit the American lines, The combination of poor coordination, dispersed forces, and artillery that could not be brought to bear in time turned the engagement into a rout. The system existed. It did not yet work the way it was designed to. The failures at Kasserine were not failures of the Fire Direction Center as a concept. They were failures of execution. The radios were on the wrong frequencies. The observers were not forward enough to see the targets. The survey data the whole system depended on was weeks old and wrong in places. The theory was sound. The men had not yet been tested enough to make it automatic. The army went back to the training base. Through 1943 and into 1944, the correction was systematic. Better maps, more radio operator training, rotation of observers through courses that taught them how to stay alive while directing fire. The procedural standard was drilled until it was reflex. Every officer going to Normandy had done it enough times that the six-element call was as natural as breathing. By the summer of 1944, the American artillery in Normandy was something the world had not seen before. A standard infantry division carried 48 field artillery tubes across 4 organic battalions, plus 18 additional towed 105mm howitzers, distributed across the 3 infantry regiment cannon companies, 66 tubes in total, all networked through their fire direction centers and able to monitor each other's radio channels. A corps had additional heavy battalions with 155mm long toms and 8-inch howitzers. Any observer anywhere in the division area with any radio could in theory reach those guns. He could also request what the doctrine called a time-on-target mission, where multiple batteries spread across 20 or 30 miles of front fired at precisely calculated intervals so that every shell from every gun arrived simultaneously. The first thing the target heard was the world ending. There was no warning round. There was no walking the fire in. There was only arrival. This was the system behind Robert Weiss on Hill 314. Now you need to understand what the Germans had on the other side of the valley, and why it could not match it. The Wehrmacht's artillery was, in many technical respects, superior to the Americans. The 88mm gun, originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery, had been repurposed as the most feared anti-tank weapon on any front. The Nebelwerfer rocket battery could put a ripple of large-caliber rockets across a wide area in seconds. German optics were superb. German gun crews were, on average, more experienced than their American counterparts in the summer of 1944. The Panzer Lehr Division alone, the Wehrmacht's premier armored formation, had trained to a standard of combined arms precision that no American division could yet match. And yet, behind all of that technical and professional excellence, the German artillery system contained a structural flaw so deeply embedded in its own logic that no one had ever thought to question it. The flaw was not in the guns. The flaw was in the chain of command that connected the guns to the targets. The German artillery forward observer, called the Vorgeschobener Beobachter, was typically a commissioned officer. He went forward with the infantry and radioed corrections back to his battery. The system he used to compute fire required him to know the precise geometric relationship between the target, himself, and the battery. The math was done at the battery itself, not at a centralized fire direction center above the battery level. The German army had never built a battalion-level fire direction center of the type Fort Sill had developed. According to military historian David Wesley's comparative analysis of World War II artillery doctrine, the average time from a German call for fire to the arrival of the first rounds was approximately 10 to 12 minutes. The equivalent American time, through the fire direction center, was approximately 3 minutes. 7 to 9 minutes. That is not a small difference. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, in a firefight where the situation changes in seconds, 7 minutes is a platoon. 7 minutes is a roadblock. But the response time was not the only difference. The more important difference was structural. A German observer could request fire from his own battery and, through time and officers, eventually from additional batteries. But this required the request to travel upward through the hierarchy and the response to travel back down. The American Fire Direction Center had eliminated that chain for tactical fires. It was the entire chain, compressed into one tent, manned by people whose entire job was to convert a radio call into steel on target, as fast as physics allowed. And there was one more thing the German system could not do. One thing that the German artilleryman's training, his culture, and the entire logic of his professional formation made almost impossible to conceive. He could not call fire on his own position. This is the thing that stunned the German infantry in the summer of 1944. Not the volume of American fire, though that was enormous. Not the accuracy, though that was improving steadily. The thing that produced genuine confusion in German after-action analyses was that American observers were directing their own artillery onto their own lines. In situations where German infantry had closed to within yards of them, German prisoners reported it. German regimental journals noted it. They could not square it with anything in their doctrine or their experience. Calling fire on your own foxhole as a deliberate tactical choice required something the German system had not built. It required the observer to trust that the fire direction center would put the rounds exactly where he said. It required the fire direction center to trust that the observer knew what he was doing and where he was. It required the entire chain of training, procedure, and institutional confidence to hold under the worst conditions imaginable. An artillery system built around the judgment of trained officers at the battery level had no mechanism to authorize a forward sergeant to override that judgment by calling steel down on himself. The thought had not occurred to anyone, because in the German framework of artillery command, it was not a sergeant's decision to make. The German army's artillery doctrine trusted the chain of command. The American artillery doctrine trusted the man with the radio. Think about what that means in practice. A German infantry regiment in Normandy, pinned by American fire behind a hedgerow, could not get artillery support without the request traveling from platoon commander to company commander to battalion commander to the regimental artillery. Liaison to the artillery battalion commander, who would then compute the mission and transmit it to the guns. Each link in that chain required a working radio or a telephone line. Each link required an officer who was not busy surviving. In the Bocage, in the summer of 1944, where communications wire was cut by shellfire within minutes of being laid, and where officers were getting killed at a rate that stripped units of their entire leadership in a single bad morning, the German artillery system was not slow because the men were incompetent. It was slow because the men were professional, and their professionalism was organized around a set of assumptions that the Bocage had made obsolete. Now, stand on Hill 314 and watch what that difference looks like in practice. August 7th, 1944. Hitler, from his headquarters in East Prussia, has ordered Operation Lüttich. 4 panzer divisions will counterattack west from Mortain, drive roughly 20 miles to the port of Avranches, cut Patton's Third Army from its supply line, and split the Allied forces in France. The attacking force includes the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart, the 2nd Panzer Division, and the 116th Panzer Division, with elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division attached. Together they number approximately 300 tanks, a mix of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and assault guns. They represent the last serious offensive capability the Germans have in the West, and Hitler is directing them personally from a bunker in East Prussia against the advice of the generals on the ground. There is one piece of terrain in their way. Hill 314 sits directly astride the German axis of advance. From its summit, an observer with field glasses can see roughly 8 miles down the valley road towards Saint-Hilaire-du-Harcouët, the critical junction on the route to Avranches. If the Germans take the hill, the observers come down and the counterattack proceeds. If the Americans hold it, every German vehicle on every road in that valley is visible to someone with a radio. The United States 30th Infantry Division, the old Hickory Division, places approximately 700 men from the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment on the hill. With them go 2 artillery forward observer teams from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Louis D. Wyman. One team is led by First Lieutenant Charles Bartz. Serving with him as fire control instrument operator is Sergeant Frank Denius, 19 years old, from Athens, Texas. Denius had enlisted at 17. He had come ashore at Omaha Beach shortly after D-Day in June 1944. By the time he reached Hill 314, he had been in nearly continuous combat for about 2 months. The other team belongs to 2nd Lieutenant Robert Weiss, from Indiana, who had arrived in France via Utah Beach on July 28. He is 21. He has been in France 11 days. Before the German attack begins, both teams do what their training tells them to do. They walk the hill. They observe every approach. They register barrage numbers on every road, every gap in the hedgerow, and every avenue by which armour could climb toward the summit. They number them on their plotting boards. Emergency Barrage 1. Emergency Barrage 2, 3, 4. If a German column appears at the farm track south of the village, the observer does not need to compute anything. He says the number. The Fire Direction Center already has the data on a card. The guns are already laid. The answer is already computed. This is the system working exactly as Brewer and Ward designed it. In a field, in a war, under fire. At 1 in the morning on August 7, the panzers come. 2 SS Panzer Grenadier companies climb the southeast slope through heavy fog, overrun an outpost at the base of the hill, and cut the road below. Within hours, 700 Americans on Hill 314 are completely surrounded. They have food and water for perhaps 2 days. Their radios are running on batteries that will fail if not recharged, and the panzer divisions circling below them have no idea what is about to happen to them. Over the next 6 days, Weiss and Bartz and Denius call 193 fire missions. They call fires on columns. They call fires on assembly areas. They call fires on the roads below, where German vehicles queue for the drive toward Avranches. They call fires on infantry climbing toward their foxholes. When the Germans get close, they walk the rounds inward. When the Germans get very close, they call the coordinates of their own position. The 230th Field Artillery Battalion fires thousands of rounds. Other battalions monitoring the net add their fires without being asked. When the radio batteries begin to die, Weiss sets spares in the sun, hoping the warmth will revive them enough for one more call. When the men on the hill run out of medical supplies, the artillerymen in the 230th's command post attempt something improvised and unprecedented. On the initiative of Major Richard E. Evans, the battalion's executive officer, they empty propaganda leaflet shells, repack them with bandages, morphine syrettes, and sulfanilamide, and fire them into the surrounded perimeter. It is an act of extraordinary ingenuity. But Weiss, who later inspected the contents when the shells were retrieved and opened, wrote that the effort was a total flop because of the high-velocity start and the sudden impact. The medical supplies did not survive the journey. 3 packages were recovered, and none of the contents were usable. The guns could do almost everything. This was one thing they could not do. On August 12, a relief column finally breaks through. More than 300 of the 700 men are killed or wounded. Weiss receives the Distinguished Service Cross. So does Bartz. Denius receives the Silver Star, the first of multiple decorations he will earn before the war ends. The German counterattack has collapsed. 4 panzer divisions with approximately 300 tanks have been stopped by a hilltop they could not take, because 2 forward observer teams with radios could see the roads below them and call steel down on anything that moved, including their own position, within 3 minutes of any target appearing. 5 days after the hill was relieved, the German army in Normandy was encircled at the Falaise pocket. The war in France was effectively over. But the story does not end at Mortain. It has another chapter, and the man at the center of it is the most decorated American soldier of the war. January 26, 1945. The Colmar Pocket in Alsace, a stand of timber called the Bois de Riedvier, outside the village of Holtzwihr. 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy commands Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. He is 19 years old. He has already earned the Distinguished Service Cross and 2 Silver Stars. When he enlisted in June 1942, his induction physical at Dallas recorded his weight at 112 pounds and his height at 5 feet 5.5 inches. Those were the measurements of a 17-year-old boy who had lied about his age to get in. At 2 in the afternoon, 6 German tanks and approximately 250 enemy infantry advance out of the village toward his position. His own tank destroyers are knocked out. He orders his men back into the trees and stays at a field phone in a forward foxhole, calling artillery. When a burning M10 tank destroyer from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion sits beside him with its crew bailed out, Murphy climbs onto the hull. He swings the 50 caliber machine gun on the turret toward the German line and begins firing. He is alone on top of a burning vehicle, in full view of 6 tanks and 250 infantry, with the machine gun in one hand and the field phone pressed to his ear with the other. The tank destroyer is on fire. Ammunition is cooking off inside it. He holds that position for nearly an hour. Through the field phone, he walks the artillery fire closer with every correction. When an American battalion officer at the other end of the line asks how close the Germans are, Murphy does not hesitate. He tells him, "If you just hold the phone a minute, I will let you talk to one of the bastards." When the fire direction officer hesitates because the rounds are landing inside Murphy's own lines, Murphy tells him he has a better chance of coming through the barrage than the Germans do. He stays on the hull. He keeps firing. He keeps the phone to his ear. The artillery kills or wounds an estimated 50 Germans around his position. The attack breaks. Murphy is wounded in the leg, refuses evacuation, organizes his remaining men, and retakes the original line. He receives the Medal of Honor 4 months later. Notice what Murphy does in that hour. He is not a trained forward observer. He is an infantry company commander. But the doctrine has pushed the call for fire procedure down to the rifle company level. He knows the procedure. He has a field phone, and when the moment demands it, he uses both in the same way Robert Weiss used them on Hill 3145 months earlier. He gives the fire direction center his own position. He trusts the system, and the system, built by obscure men at a dusty post in Oklahoma during a budget freeze, does exactly what it was designed to do. Murphy receives the Medal of Honor as the most decorated American soldier of the war. When reporters ask him later how he could have stayed on that burning tank destroyer, he does not talk about courage. He gives answers that sound more like an engineer describing a problem he solved. He talks about angles of fire, about the position of the German tanks relative to the tree line, about why the turret gave him a better field of fire than the foxhole. The system had given him a vocabulary for it. Now ask the question the German army never found an answer to. If calling fire on your own position is this effective, why did they never develop the procedure themselves? The answer is not that they were rigid in all things. The German army's infantry tactics were in many ways more flexible than the Americans. Their concept of mission-type orders gave battalion and company commanders wider latitude to deviate from plans than American doctrine typically allowed. Below the company level, German soldiers were often more tactically creative than their American counterparts. The rigidity was specifically in artillery, and the reason for it goes back to 1916. At Verdun and the Somme, the German artillery had developed the most sophisticated indirect fire system in the world, the creeping barrage, the predicted fire technique. The short preparation assault method that nearly broke the Allied line on the Western Front in March 1918, all of these were elaborate, centralized, pre-arranged operations, planned over days and requiring meticulous computation. They worked spectacularly. The lesson the German military academy system drew from the First World War was that centralized, pre-arranged, hierarchically controlled artillery was the correct answer. And for the kind of war they had fought between 1914 and 1918, it was. The doctrine that followed from that lesson said, artillery was a specialist weapon requiring specialist management. Fire missions were routed upward through the chain of command and distributed downward as orders. The man at the top of the artillery hierarchy held the picture. The man at the bottom served the plan. Allowing a sergeant to call steel down on his own position, bypassing every link in that chain, was not just unusual, it was structurally incoherent. The chain of command was not built to authorize it. The training system did not include it. The doctrine did not contemplate it. The American army had drawn a different lesson from the same war. Fort Sill had asked a different question. Not how do we control artillery from the top, but how do we get the right rounds to the right place as fast as possible for the man who can see the target? The answer was the fire direction center, a centralized computation node that served the man at the front rather than directing him. And the corollary, the one that nobody wrote into a field manual because it was simply how the system functioned, was that the man at the front was trusted. His call was valid. His judgment, in the moment, with the enemy 30 yards away, carried the same authority as a colonel's. No German doctrine manual contained that sentence. No German staff college taught it. And when German officers encountered it in the interrogation reports of captured American forward observers, or in their own analyses of why American artillery was doing things theirs could not, they had no framework to explain it. They were looking at a culture. They were looking at a country that had decided, without writing it down, that the man closest to the problem was the man most qualified to solve it. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Division during Operation Cobra on July 25, 1944, described what that looked like from the receiving end. He wrote that the carpet bombing left his positions looking like a moonscape, with bomb craters touching rim to rim and that all signal communications had been cut and no command was possible. Separately, he wrote that over 70% of his soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. His division, the most powerful single-armoured formation Germany had in the West, had been reduced to wreckage in a single day by the combination of air bombardment and the relentless American artillery that followed immediately behind it, directed by observers on every available piece of high ground who could call steel down on any target that moved. The pattern at Mortain and Holtzwihr was not isolated. It repeated across the Western Front wherever forward observers were present and conditions allowed. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945, artillery liaison officers of the 7th Armoured Division refused to displace their guns as German armour broke through, and instead called fire onto the road junctions directly in front of their own command posts. In the Hürtgen Forest, in November 1944, observers of the 22nd Infantry Regiment called tree burst rounds, so close to their own forward platoons that survivors described feeling wood splinters against their helmets. Then there was a new weapon that sharpened every lesson learned since Mortain. In the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, American gunners began using the proximity fuse against German ground targets for the first time. Eisenhower formally requested clearance on December 19, 1944. 2 days later, all restrictions were lifted. The proximity fuse was a miniature radio transmitter built into the nose of a shell. It detected the ground below and detonated the round 30 to 50 feet in the air, raining fragments straight down on troops who would otherwise be safe in foxholes. General Patton wrote to the Chief of Army Ordnance in January 1945 about catching a German battalion crossing the Sauer River with a concentrated barrage. He wrote that they killed by actual count 702. He called the new shell with the funny fuse devastating and said that when all armies had it, they would have to devise some new method of warfare. The proximity fuse was the technological capstone of the system Brewer and Ward had built at Fort Sill. It worked the way it did only because the doctrine already existed to use it, because a single observer could mass the fires of multiple battalions on a single target, and because the man closest to the enemy was trusted to make the call. The doctrine did not die in 1945. It carried forward into every American conflict that followed. In February 1951, in the Korean village of Chipyong-ni, Colonel Paul Freeman's 23rd Regimental Combat Team and the French battalion were surrounded by 3 Chinese divisions. Inside the perimeter sat Battery B of the 503rd Field Artillery Battalion, with 6 155mm howitzers. When Chinese infantry broke through the southern perimeter in the early morning hours of February 15, those howitzers traversed and fired white phosphorus at ranges measured in hundreds of yards, directly over the heads of their own infantry, driving Chinese soldiers into the open where they could be cut down. The 23rd held. It was among the clearest American tactical victories of the Korean War. In June 1953, Sergeant Ola Mize of Company K, 15th Infantry Regiment, the same regiment Audie Murphy had served in 8 years earlier, was defending Outpost Harry on the nights of June 10 and 11 against waves of infantry from the Chinese 74th Division. When enemy soldiers reached the trench lines of his own position, Mize took a radio from a wounded officer and called artillery onto his own outpost. He survived. He received the Medal of Honor. In November 1965, in the Ia Drang Valley of Vietnam, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was surrounded at Landing Zone X-Ray by North Vietnamese regiments. Moore ordered his Air Force liaison officer, 1st Lieutenant Charlie Hastings, to transmit the code phrase "Broken Arrow," meaning an American unit was in danger of being overrun and all available fires should converge. More than 4,000 artillery rounds were fired in close support on the first day alone. Approximately 33,000 rounds were fired over the 3-day battle. Moore's men held. The procedure Weiss used on Hill 314 in August 1944 was still saving American soldiers in the jungles of Southeast Asia 21 years later. The procedure did not change because the insight behind it did not change. The man at the front can see what no one behind him can see. Trust him. Give him the radio. Build the system to serve him. That is the thesis. Not bravery alone, though bravery was present in quantities that are difficult to comprehend. What made it possible was the doctrine. A chain of training and institutional confidence that, said the lieutenant in the foxhole, knew what he was looking at, and that the institution would put every available gun at his disposal the moment he asked. The German army never built that, not because they lacked the technical knowledge, but because their artillery system was built on a different premise. The premise that fire was best managed from above, by trained officers who held the full picture, routed through command channels designed to ensure coordination and prevent mistakes. It was a sound premise. It had produced the most effective artillery doctrine in the world in 1918. It was simply the wrong answer for a war where the situation changed faster than command channels could process it. Robert Weiss came down off Hill 314 on August 12, 1944. He went on through the Bulge and across the Rhine. After the war, he went to law school, founded a firm in Portland, Oregon that later became part of Holland and Knight, and practiced business law for half a century. He wrote his account of Hill 314 in a book called Fire Mission, published in 1997. It is a quiet book. There is no self-promotion in it. He died in Portland, Oregon, an old man surrounded by his family. Sergeant Frank Denius came home to Athens, Texas. He enrolled at the University of Texas and graduated in 1949 with degrees in business and law. He practiced law in Austin for 50 years. He became a fixture at Longhorn football games and a friend to presidents. He published his memoir in 2016 and titled it On the Way, the 3 words the Fire Direction Center said over the radio every time he sent a fire mission. The rounds are in the air. They are coming. On the way. He died at his home in Austin on July 29, 2018. He was 93 years old. Audie Murphy came home to a country that put him on the cover of Life magazine and offered him a Hollywood contract. He made 44 films. He adapted his war memoir for the screen and played himself in the movie. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow until the end of his life, tormented by what his generation called combat fatigue and what doctors now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He died in a plane crash near Roanoke, Virginia on May 28, 1971. He was 45 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Section 46, near the Memorial Amphitheater. The Sergeant Audie Murphy Club notes that his grave is the second most visited at Arlington after President Kennedy's, and the cemetery installed a special flagstone walkway to accommodate the volume of visitors. People still leave coins on the stone. Carlos Brewer, the Kentucky artilleryman who rebuilt the gunnery doctrine at Fort Sill in the late 1920s, never commanded his troops in combat. He was over the age limit for Armored Division commanders and was removed from the 12th Armored Division before it deployed to Europe. He then voluntarily reverted from his wartime acting rank of Major General to Colonel in order to obtain a combat assignment, and served in occupied Germany as the 7th Army artillery officer. He later taught ROTC at Ohio State, retired in 1950, and died in Columbus, Ohio in September 1976. He was 85 years old. He received no public recognition for the Fire Direction Center. His name does not appear in most histories of the war. The system he helped build fired tens of millions of rounds across 3 major wars before it was retired. The Fort Sill gunnery department where he worked still stands. They named nothing after him there either. The work was its own memorial. The men are gone. The system they built is not. Fort Sill still teaches it. The 6-element call format is still the standard. The principle that the man at the front has the picture and should have the gun is built into every close fire support procedure in the modern American military. A joint terminal attack controller, who might be a staff sergeant, can today direct a precision munition onto a target 50 meters from his own position, because the doctrine says the person closest to the enemy is the person most qualified to direct the fire. The technology has changed. The insight has not moved an inch since Orlando Ward demonstrated it on the ranges of Fort Sill in the early 1930s. The infantry sergeant in 1944 and the joint terminal attack controller of today are connected by the same thread. Not the same radio, not the same weapon, not the same enemy, the same idea. The man at the front is trusted. The man at the front has the gun. Everything behind him exists to put that gun where he points it. The Germans could not explain what they were fighting at Mortain and Holtzwihr, because the thing they were fighting was not a weapon, it was a decision about who to trust. The artillery was not the decisive factor. The decisive factor was the doctrine behind it. The decision made at Fort Sill in the 1930s that the man at the bottom of the hierarchy was the point of the hierarchy and that everything above him existed to serve him. That decision, made quietly and without fanfare in the lean years before the war, outlasted every tank, every gun, and every uniform of the conflict that tested it. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment with the name of someone in your family who served. I read them. Subscribe if you have not, because the next story is about a different war and a different kind of invisible advantage, and you will want to be there. Thank you for watching.